Hi, I'm Ian, and this is my series on vintage role-playing games from back in the day, and many of these role-playing games are now available again thanks to the nostalgia market, where companies are republishing old editions now, and also through sites like Drive-Thru RPG, where these editions are available in PDF format or print on demand. Now, with all of these different editions of these old games now available again, it can be a bit daunting to someone coming into this, especially if they've just done a search for something like Dungeons & Dragons and they're presented with a whole litany of editions. So hopefully this series will try to unravel some of that. We've already covered basic Dungeons & Dragons in a previous video, and today is the turn of the grandfather of them all. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition. Dungeons & Dragons itself, as we've touched on in previous videos, was first published in 1974 by TSR and was very successful between 74 and 77 as a game unto itself, with numerous supplements being released for it. But one of the problems with it was that as the idea of playing role-playing games at conventions grew, it was found that the D&D rules as written in that 1974 edition were subject to interpretations, to house rules, to all sorts of things. So trying to put it together in a tournament setting, as a competitive game, was really, really difficult. So part of the problem is the rules were so light as to be open to interpretation, and the other side of that is that there is no definitive winning and losing to a role-playing game. So going forward from there, Gary Gygax, one of the authors of the original game, took it upon himself to go and to codify, to collate all of the information, all of the rules that had been published for D&D so far, to re-examine them, rewrite them, and to come up with a standard edition that gave a consistency enough to be able to, if you went from your home game to a tournament to play at a convention or whatever, then everyone sort of understood where the rules were. So a consistent set of rules for playing Dungeons & Dragons. And this he started to publish piecemeal as he was writing them from 1977 on as the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game. And the first release for the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game came in the form of the Monster Manual. Now, the idea behind publishing this one first was simply that it was still compatible with the other games. And as the ideas that were going to be formed into Advanced Dungeons & Dragons itself were still in the melting pot, some of the baselines, especially things like monster stats and so on, had already really come out of the classic game. So this book is really compatible with the 74 edition, the classic edition of the game, brought in a lot of material from those. It's also partially compatible with the basic game. So you could use the monsters out of this, ignore some of the statistics that don't really make any sense to that edition of the game, and still make use of this book for those statistics. And then in 1978 came along the Player's Handbook. So unlike editions of the game that we know today and from 2nd edition on, the Player's Handbook for 1st edition isn't the main rulebook of the game. Might seem weird that it would be the second book published if that wasn't the case, but that's so bear with this. It really was a book containing the information that players needed to know about classes, about how to create a character. The spells are in here, equipment is in here. The actual rules of the game, how to use all of these statistics, were in the next book along. 1979, the Dungeon Master's Guide came. But for now, in 1978, we had the Player's Handbook, and we also had a few articles from Dragon magazine that were releasing the rules as had been put together by that point that were going to be in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So this book, plus those articles, you could start playing Advanced Dungeons & Dragons to a certain extent. And then, as I said, in 1979, my poor old battered, heavily referenced copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, these 3 books, over the course from 77 to 79, form the core of the advanced Dungeons and Dragons game. The Dungeon Master's Guide is really one of those books that is crazily important to the role-playing industry as a whole. And if you play any role-playing or fantasy role-playing game especially, then this book is really essential, if only for the appendices themselves, but as a reference work for any fantasy game, it's brilliant, even though its main focus is on the rules for advanced Dungeons and Dragons. As you can say in my old, however old it was at the time, writing Tengwa, one book to rule them all. So that was the core. By 1979, all of the books necessary to play advanced Dungeons and Dragons had been released, and so off they went. Now, TSR, the publishers, had learned, as we discussed in the basic video, they had learned that modules were a thing, adventure modules were a thing. So by the time 1977-78 came around, TSR were in the game of publishing their own modules, and this is what they did. So in 1978 we also got the release by Gary Guy Jackson and a number of other authors for TSR of a number of adventure modules. Now these were all, weirdly, they were all high level or high-ish level. So we had the Giant series, G1, 2 and 3. We had the Drow series, the D1, 2 and 3. The Giant series starts at 8th level and goes on, and the Drow series follows onto it. Now these were being written at the same time as Skyjax was writing the rulebooks as well. So some of the elements on there and the monsters and so on found their way into the Dungeon Master's Guide. These modules were released 78, 79. The DM's Guide came out in 79. So there are mention of things like mesodaemons and so on in the Dungeon Master's Guide monster tables that were originally published in the D series of modules. For those not familiar with that kind of concept, back in those days, adventure modules carried a letter key and a number that showed you the theme of the module. So G for giants, D for drow, and so on, and the order in sequence. And G1, 2, and 3 did follow on from each other. So did D1, 2, and 3. There were exceptions to this. So the S series, the special series, starting in 1978 with the Tomb of Horrors, if anyone knows that was S1, and White Plume Mountain, which was S2. They were sort of standalones. There would be later modules along those lines as well. An introductory module was also released in the form of the Village of Homlet, code T1, which would later grow in the mid-80s into the Temple of Elemental Evil, which was one of the standout modules that was released for first edition game. Now, first edition, because of its familiarity, it being used at tournaments and competitions and so on, first edition became the standard. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons became the standard go-to game for D&D players. It overtook basic Dungeons and Dragons to quite a large extent. Basic D&D still had its followers, still had its players. I played both editions, but the majority of players were switching over to the advanced D&D game. So TSR put a lot more support into it. In 1980, they translated what used to be the Gods, Demigods and Heroes book from the original game into Deities and Demigods, and this book has a history all of itself. And then in 1981, there's a collaboration with the UK company Games Workshop. The Fiend Folio came out, and it was largely produced by UK authors who had written for a magazine article called The Fiend Factory in the pages of White Dwarf back in the day. The Fiend Factory was a column that produced monsters. Readers would write their monsters in. And the Fiend Factory Fiend Folio, was largely a compilation of monsters that had been released by Games Workshop through the pages of White Dwarf in the Fiend Factory column. Published in 1981, It was also the sort of beginnings of TSR UK that would do some other things with the game as well. And there were some modules, some monsters in here that had been previously released in modules. For example, go back to the Mesodaemon. So the Mesodaemon came in the Drow series of modules. Its basic stats were in the Dungeon Master's Guide back from 1978, but its full stats were in the Fiend Folio. So we've mentioned that TSR were late to the table in publishing adventures for Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games in general. But they were also late to the table in terms of publishing campaign settings. And this didn't happen until 1980. Previous to that, Judges Guild had published Dave Arneson's Blackmoor campaign. They'd also done their own Wilderness campaign setting. And a number of the companies had produced game worlds for role-playing games. Glorantha for RuneQuest is a really famous example of that. But it wasn't until 1980 that TSR got onto this particular bandwagon. And they published the Greyhawk Folio, which gave you a bit of a detail about the world of Greyhawk, with a nice big poster map and a booklet of information that was enough for DMs to fire their imaginations and build some of their own campaigns in that particular world. It was further enhanced in 1982 by a box set that expanded the folio booklet into a couple of books with a lot more information in it. So Greyhawk was really the first campaign setting that TSR published for the Dungeons and Dragons game. In 1983, TSR started going through a brand overhaul. This affected Dungeons and Dragons as well as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual, they all got their own recovered versions of their books. The interesting thing there is the cover for the recover for the Dungeon Master's Guide, with a wizard, supposedly the Dungeon Master, opening the doors on whatever horrors lurk behind, had the caption inside the book itself still describing the Efreet and the encounter with that Efreet, with the adventurers there had travelled to the Plane of Fire. So they'd updated the covers and the Dungeons and Dragons logos, but they didn't do much with the content insofar as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. As we mentioned in the basic Dungeons and Dragons video, they did overhaul the content of the basic Dungeons and Dragons rules, but with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, they just put new covers on it, even leaving the captions that describe the covers on alone. Also in 1983, they expanded the selection of monsters out for the game in the Monster Manual 2. And here we can see the new logo and the new format for the covers and so on. All of the recovered and books going forward had an orange spine. So if you see a copy of the Player's Handbook or whatever, it's got an orange spine. It's from the 1983 recovered editions and not the 1978 original editions. So the Monster Manual 2, like the Fiend Folio, it compiled some monsters that had been previously published in modules up to that point, but it also put some new original designs in there and some monsters that were published in Dragon magazine. So it was really a compilation. And one of the on release, one of the hints that were given is that possibly there could be a new monster book every year as a sort of Dungeons and Dragons annual. Now we did see that in later editions, especially in second edition that did Monsters Compendium annuals, and later in third and fourth editions, which did a number of sequential monster manuals. But in first edition, the Monster Manual 3 never appeared. We had the Monster Manual 2, and that's as far as we got. 1984 was an interesting year, a seismic shift for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I'll warn you, I might not make some fans happy with all of this, but in that year, the second campaign setting for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition arrived, and that was the Dragonlance setting. Now, the way the Dragonlance setting was released was as a series of modules initially, and the first 5 of these, which came out in 1984, followed the first volume of a series of novels that were being released at the same time as the adventures. There's the first novel, 1984 novel, was Dragons of Autumn Twilight, and dungeon modules DL1 through to DL5, DL5 being a sort of capstone source book for that first book. They followed roughly the path that the adventures in the novels took. The reason why I might upset some people here is I am a fan of the world of Dragonlance. I think it's got some really nice ideas, especially with magic tracking the moons and so on. I'm really not a fan of the adventures. The problem with the modules, the previous adventures that had been released for Dungeons and Dragons and all editions up to that point had been location-based modules. It was, here's a location somewhere for your adventurers to go in order to achieve some goal. Now, these were easily slotted into any campaign. There were backgrounds to those adventure modules to a lesser or greater degree. You had, for example, Keep on the Borderlands, which it was very setting light. It had a ravine. It had a bit of a map that showed you a location of the eponymous keep to the ravine with all of these mini dungeons in it, and that was about it. You could pretty much slot it in anywhere that had a bit of a wood and a bit of a ravine in it, so that worked from that point of view. And you were left, as a dungeon master, you were left to take these things, elements of your own imagination or your own world, and use this sort of mini setting to fiddle around with. Even modules that had a more extensive thing. So in 1983, the Ravenloft module came out, I6, and even that was a location based. You had a village that was under threat from a powerful vampire in a castle, and it was up to the adventurers to sort that out. But as far as anything around that went, there was nothing beyond the initial scenario setup. Here is a situation. Players need to go and try and figure out what's going on. So these were location-based adventures. Some of them did have background. A lot of the background was window dressing. Some of the background was important to the plot, but the plot was largely made by the players and the DM interacting with each other. The issue with Dragonlance, it was a plot-driven. There were locations in it, but the overarching point of the modules was to provide the Dungeon Master with a plot to guide the players through. And I'm going to give you a couple of direct quotes from the modules that may illustrate what my issue is with them. So the first one of those is the advice to the DM to motivate your players subtly to follow the right path. Now, this isn't presenting the players with a situation and allowing the players to figure their way through it and come what may, and then work out the consequences of that afterwards. This is the DM actively trying to usher the players down a particular path. And the hints were, there is a right path through these plot-driven modules. You just have to sort of gently push the players along that path. Now, there were tricks and so on that you could do to do that so subtly as to make the players believe that they are doing all of this on their own. But as a DM, something fell foul, especially to a certain generation of DMs where we didn't have modules at the start. The adventures, we were left to ourselves to decide what kind of worlds and adventures and so on that we wanted to play. And even when TSR started publishing modules, and even when Judges Guild were doing it as well, they had Wilderlands, but it was very setting light. You could lift anything out of Wilderlands and put it wherever you liked. You could lift everything about the early TSR modules, like the Giant series. You could take the steading of the Giants as Hill Giant Chief, and you could put that anywhere you liked. There was no nailed down fixed plot to what was going on. With Dragonlance, no, you were advised to subtly keep the players on that plot line. The other major issue is with the major NPCs, the major enemies of the plot as they go along, were often explained to be turning up in later installments. So rather than have the players outright achieve victory over these guys, to actually kill them and attain their victory and be able to stand there and go, oh, we've beaten this guy. The DM was encouraged to go down an obscure death route. The idea there being the players think they've beaten him, but they can't be sure. Maybe the body fell into the mists down a ravine and they can't see what's going on, and so on. And that, again, I think that detracts from the players. I would much rather each individual module be self-contained in that way. Instead of saying this character may turn up in a module in the future, so don't kill him, give him an obscure death. I would much rather the DM to be said that we may use this character again. Don't worry about it. So try and have him escape in some way. But if he doesn't, then fine. If the players outsmart the guy and they do manage to defeat the guy, then do that. Then allow the players to go and have their victory and have their "we have achieved this" moment. And then maybe in the later modules where they say, okay, this guy is the same guy as was in that module, but if the players have already defeated him, then you can use the same stats, but give him a different name, give him some different affectations, a bit different personality, so make him into a different guy. If they've already defeated that guy, if he didn't escape, then use someone else. But the stats can be the same. It doesn't really matter there. But the don't diminish the players' achievements, and the fact that the modules outright advise you to do that, in my mind, there's something up there. I think the last thing that really got me about the adventures is they gave you the stats for the characters from the books, which is, that's okay, but the fact that those books did exist, those characters had arcs and personalities and so on that were described in the books. And what that, whether intended or not, what that encouraged players to do was to say that I want to play my favourite character from the book. And there was a tendency to try and play the character as they appeared in the book and follow the same the development arc as they did in the book. Some people took the characters from the published characters from the game and made them their own, and some people created their own characters. There was nothing specifically there to say you must use the characters from the books, but there was, whether intentionally or unconsciously there or whatever, there was that underlying temptation to go and take the characters, play them as the books, and expect them to follow the same story arc. Which to me is, I see a D&D table as people sitting down and writing their own stories, not as semi-blindly walking through someone else's novel. Mileage varies, but the Dragonlance adventures are not for me. The Dragonlance novels are okay. The really terrible thing, or the really terrible crime of the Dragonlance modules in my mind, is that they sold really well, they did really well, and they have influenced a lot of the way that adventures are designed and published these days. If you look at the adventure path from modules from 3rd edition, if you look at the current way that adventures are published now in 5th edition, you are presented with a plot that you are expected to take characters through from encounter to encounter. They have got a little bit better about side quests and managing players that go off plot or whatever, but there is still that concept of here is a story, subtly guide the players through the story. And that, to me, that's playing someone else's novel. That isn't a collaborative storytelling process with the players and DM around the table, or online these days or whatever. But I think with the publication of the Dragonlance modules from 1984, I think the game diminished. So enough of that rant, and on to 1985. So in 1985, the rules for the AD&D 1st edition game took a bit of an expansion into a couple of different directions. So in that year, we had a couple of books released. We had the Unearthed Arcana. Now, this book is both a blessing and a bugbear. It was released with typos all over the place that really did give power gamers a bit of a kick. But it was it's an interesting book. It expands the rules to the game, some new classes, some new races, or some race stats for some of the races that were previously described in books like the Monster Manual and Monster Manual 2. New spells, magical items. Like the Monster Manual 2, it's largely a compilation of material that came out in Dragon magazine and modules prior to it. The other book that came out in '85 was Oriental Adventures. This was an interesting book. It took Chinese and Japanese and a number of other Eastern mythologies and history and squashed them all together. So if you're going to go to this book expecting a Japanese setting or a Chinese setting and what have you, it doesn't give you. It gives you a sort of mongrel hybrid of them all. It's a nice book, but if you're the type that gets upset by things not being specifically compartmentalized into this belongs to this culture, this belongs to this culture, this belongs to this culture, then you might find this book a bit horrendous. But in the same way that the standard game for both basic and advanced Dungeons and Dragons squashes a lot of European mythology and history, all the way from the Vikings to Greeks to medieval fantasies to Arthurian to Celts, whatever, squashes all of that down into one set of rules and one game. This does the same. So you might get offended by the way that it's laid out and the way it's put together, but it's no more offensive in what it sets out to do than the way that the core game does it. And it's, at the end of the day, it's a fantasy role-playing game. This is not meant to give you an overview of those cultures, and it's not meant to diminish them, and it's not meant to insult them in any way. It might offend some people, but try not to be. One of the things that Oriental Adventures also introduced was the hint of another setting, an Oriental themed setting that would be added to Dungeons and Dragons, and it was sort of described as maybe a part of the world of Greyhawk, maybe just a generic thing that could be plugged in. But as we will see a little bit later, we will see that it got subsumed into the juggernaut of all Dungeons and Dragons campaign settings. By the time we got to 1985, there were also articles flying around about the second edition of the game. In the pages of Dragon magazine, Gary Gygax had already discussed the shape that a second edition might take, and for various reasons, by the time it came for TSR to do the second edition of the game, Gygax was no longer involved in it. So 1986, 1987 were sort of transition years that I think people had got into their head that a second edition was coming. By 1987 coming around, it was definite. The pages of Dragon magazine introduced a column that was discussing the changes and things that may be coming in second edition. But in 86 and 87, nonetheless, the three final expansions to the core first edition rules came out. And we're going to kind of deal with all three of these together. So the first was the Dungeoneer Survival Guide. The second was the Wilderness Survival Guide, and the final one, we've got in order: Dungeoneer Survival Guide, Wilderness Survival Guide, and then the final one was the Manual of the Plains. Now these three books are really environmental. They provide rules for their particular environments: dungeons, the wilderness, and then extraplanar encounters. And they get a little bit esoteric in the way that they deal with things, but they do, particularly the Dungeoneers and the Wilderness Survival Guide, they do provide some important clarifications and some important expansions to things. So non-weapon proficiency, the concept of that was introduced in Oriental Adventures as a sort of to give you the more sort of esoteric poetry and calligraphy and so on, to provide a more courtly element to the game rather than always going around and beating monsters up. With the Dungeoneers and Wilderness Survival Guide, those non-weapon proficiencies or the concept of them, was more nailed down and brought into the core game. The final couple of releases that came out for the first edition game were Dragonlance Adventures, which was a compilation of rules, races, character classes and so on for the Dragonlance campaign setting, and Greyhawk Adventures. Greyhawk Adventures is an odd one. It's more a compilation of magic items and odd bits of lore here and there, and a few spells and so on. But it's a weird book because it straddles both first and second editions. It was written for both games and sort of fails at both. Still some interesting things in there, especially if you're a Greyhawk fan. I mean, it's some books that are specifically laid out for a particular world can have interesting things that you can bring in to your own campaign settings. But I would say that both the Dragonlance Adventures book and the Greyhawk Adventures book very solidly belong to their worlds and don't really add anything to the core game. 1987 also, we finally saw Kara-Tur coming out as a box set. But prior to that, we'd had another campaign setting introduced. Now here's where you kind of have to count. The Forgotten Realms campaign setting was released in 1987, and you can either take it as the third campaign setting that TSR had released, previous being Greyhawk, and then Kryn, Dragonlance, then Forgotten Realms, or you can add in those campaign settings that TSR had published either in the pages of the magazines that they published or in separate books and modules, in which case the whole thing gets messy. But primarily on those, TSR had published source books for the first edition AD&D covering the Lankhmar novels of Fritz Lieber. They'd also published some adventures set in Hyboria for Conan the Barbarian, and they'd also published a campaign setting in the pages of Imagine, which was, you can kind of see it as the equivalent to Dragon Magazine for the UK. And that campaign setting was Pelennor. So those three campaign settings were published in between an official kind of capacity prior to the Forgotten Realms. This is all rambling and nonsense. I'm just saying that there's a whole scope of things that TSR were doing. Now, the Forgotten Realms was released in 1987 as a box set, written by Ed Greenwood, thoroughly nice guy, and writer of some of the greatest articles that have been published in Dragon Magazine. And a lot of those he tied into the Forgotten Realms. So the Forgotten Realms had been bubbling away in first edition in the pages of Dragon Magazine for some while before it finally got a campaign setting box set for it in 87. And from then on, especially through second edition, it became an absolute juggernaut of a campaign setting. And like I mentioned, the Kara-Tur box set came out using the same format, couple of books, few maps, as the Forgotten Realms campaign setting box set, and that was released in 88, firmly as a first edition product, but definitely had the big Forgotten Realms banner across the top that firmly bolted it to the growing Forgotten Realms campaign setting. And so 1989 rolls round and we get the first releases for the second edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and that is all for another story. The play of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons goes along the same way as it does for any other fantasy role-playing game. You create your characters and you go off and have adventures with those characters. It is related to the previous edition and its sister edition in Basic Dungeons and Dragons. A number of the concepts that Advanced Dungeons and Dragons compiles originally came from those classic games. So it does play the same. There are some core concepts within it that go beyond those from those previous games. They could be said to be more advanced. Some of the things like in previous editions, you had a set bonus depending on your ability score. It didn't matter which ability score it was, the bonus that you had applied to whatever elements of the game that were controlled by that particular ability score carried the same bonus. In Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, that was extended out, and it was different for each ability score. So, for example, to gain a +1 bonus to melee combat, you needed a strength of 17, but to gain a +1 to your armor class, then you needed a dexterity of 16, and to gain a +1 to your hit points per hit dice, you needed a 15 of constitution. So even there was no consistency in the modifiers. Each ability score was its own compartmentalized thing. Also, the number of modifiers and elements to the game that were controlled by each of the ability scores was extended out. So instead of just an ability score provides a modifier, it was an ability score provides a modifier to this, a percentage chance to that, a 1 in 6 chance to do that. It also adds a different number onto this particular part of the game. It can give that character some bonus spells. It can prevent this character from casting spells above a certain level. It can all sorts of things. Each of different apply to your thieves' abilities. Your dexterity give you percentile bonuses to various thieving abilities. So there were very specific minimum and maximum scores for combinations of character types. These covered race and class and gender. So if you wanted a character that had 1800 strength, then that had to be a male human fighter, because they were the only characters that can achieve an 1800 strength. If you want to know what I mean by 1800, if you were a fighter and you had if you rolled a score of 18 on 3 6-sided dice for your strength, then you also got to roll percentile dice too. So you could have 18/49 or 18/86 or 1800, best strength in the game, until the Unearthed Arcana came along and gave you certain characters that could have 19. Classes themselves were split into categories. So you had primary classes and you had subclasses. So the primary classes: fighter, magic user, cleric, thief, and the addition of monks. Now all of these were the classes that people would recognise from the classic game. Addition to these were subclasses that had also appeared in the classic rules and in the pages of Dragon Magazine Strategic Review by that time. And these were added as subclasses, and the rules again got a bit muddied. So some of the rules would refer to a fighter, for example, and the rules that apply to fighters usually apply to fighters and subclasses of fighters. So if it said fighters can do X, then it meant that fighters and the subclasses, which in those times were paladins and rangers, so fighters and paladins and rangers can do that. But in other parts of the rules, it would use fighters as fighters only, but there wouldn't be any absolute clear definition of which part of the rules meant fighters only and which part of the rules meant fighters and their subclasses. So that was a bit of an issue, and Dragon Magazine resolved it, and some of the errata resolved that sort of that side of the issues. But the issue there is not everyone was getting those magazines, so a lot of people just made it up whether it meant the two or not. Clerics had a subclass of druids, and thieves had a subclass of assassin, and magic users had a subclass of illusionist. The illusionist was the hint of the specialist wizards that would come in with second edition. You also had a strange class, the bard. It appeared in the pages of Strategic Review as a strange combination of a bunch of classes, and it had to circumvent the dual class rules in order for it to work. Normally, only humans could be dual class. As far as bard's concerned, you could be a half-elf, and as a half-elf, you could then use the dual class rules in order to achieve becoming a bard. Now, the idea behind the bards is it's implied, not implicitly stated, but implied that you needed to set out on the road in order to be a bard right from the start. And to my mind, I can't quite grasp the idea as if you're going to have that as the single progression for a class, going through all of these other classes and then go through, why not just say this is a class under its own right, these are the requirements for it, same as any other class, and you don't need to go through all of these other classes before, because that's all structured into the class we're describing. It seemed overcomplicated. It didn't quite fit. It had to break rules in order to exist. So I think it was a bad inclusion in the core game, my opinion. Another addition in the core game that I think it could have really done without was the inclusion of psionics, mind powers. Now, what it did there was to lift the rules that had previously appeared in Eldritch Wizardry and put an AD&D slant on them, but they never really fit. They could be a horrible balancing issue with the game. If you rolled well, you had to roll to acquire them, and if you rolled well and acquired them, there was nothing that you gave up in order to get them. So, and they were very spell-like. It's like if you rolled well on those, you would end up with some magical abilities, some additional spell-like abilities that you could then use without incurring either an experience point penalty or anything like that. It was really, you could end up with overly powered, unbalanced characters. So I think the Bard and I think psionics could have been left out of the game. I think they overcomplicated things, and I don't think they particularly added anything other than confusion to the game. But other than that, creating a character, you roll 6-sided dice to determine your ability scores. Those 6-sided dice, in this case, there were a number of different of methods that were described in the Dungeon Master's Guide as to how you might do that. The DM would choose which one he wanted his players to use. We used roll 4d6 and discard the lowest one. Now, in previous editions, it had always been roll 3d6 for each one and then figure out what class you can be from there and so on. In AD&D, it lets you roll this with a bias towards high scores, and then from there you could arrange them around and select which class you wanted to play. Now, one of the recognitions that the game had was that these characters are heroes. They're meant to be a cut above the average Joe in the fields or whatever. So therefore, high scores are good and kind of expected as well. So the game advised that a player character should have a score of 15 or more in at least 2 abilities to be heroic, or to have a chance of surviving until they became a hero. So once that was done, once your ability scores had been generated, you then got to choose your race and your class and your gender. And you had to look through the tables and the minimums and maximums to make sure that your character fit with the minimums and maximums, the scores that you'd actually rolled. Some scores were a bit of a no-brainer as well. Wizards, for example, you could be a wizard, a magic user, with an intelligence of 9, but it's say goodbye to your high-level spells because you'll never be able to cast them. You couldn't be a fighter with a strength of less than 9, and you couldn't be a dwarf with a constitution less than 7, maybe. I don't want to look that up, but there were minimums on races, and there were maximums on races, and there were minimums on classes, and there were also minimums and maximums placed on gender. So, strange set of things. A lot of people chose to ignore, especially the gender ones, because they kind of made no sense, and didn't really want that level of misogyny in our role-playing games. The Unearthed Arcana book introduced a number of other different dice rolling techniques, and these were meant to push your character towards a class you wanted to play. So, for example, if you wanted to play a fighter, then instead of rolling 4 6-sided dice for strength and picking the highest 3, you'd roll something like 9 6-sided dice for strength and pick the highest 3 from that, further biasing your ability scores towards the scores that would be required to succeed in that particular class. That was an interesting method. I'm not sure how many people took up its use. Our group certainly didn't, but it was there if you wanted to use it. The Unearthed Arcana also introduced a number of other character classes, so the Barbarian, the Cavalier, the Thief Acrobat. It did some other jiggery-pokery by moving things around. The Paladin then moved across to being a subset of Cavalier, which I think again was a strange thing to do, and also introduced some other sort of weirdness into that. It meant that did paladins now get everything that cavaliers got? And the answer there was largely yes. But with the typos that made cavaliers overly powerful, paladins that were already on the brink of that to start with suddenly became superheroes. So once you've got your ability scores, you've chosen your race, you've chosen your gender, you've chosen your class, buy equipment, and you're ready to go. You could go and delve into the Dungeon Master's Guide to determine your character's age and your maximum age, just in case you run into a horde of ghosts. Very important. And you could go into the personality traits tables. This is one of the reasons why the Dungeon Master's Guide is brilliant. Tables for all sorts of stuff, random esoteria, including these personality traits tables, which are great. If you want to go and figure out some keywords for your character, either read through these lists and pick a few, or roll randomly if you need some inspiration. But at the end of the day, you could end up with 4 or 5 keywords that you could build your character's personality on just through these tables. Play itself, pretty much the same as previous editions. You cross-referenced your character's class and level with your target's armor class in order to fight them. That would give you a number on a 20-sided dice in order to successfully hit them. To resist spells, dragon breath, whatever, you would look up your class and your level. That would give you a 20-sided dice target number in order to save. Again, like with basic D&D, you didn't have a saving throw based on your ability scores. So it wasn't categorized by will, fortitude, and reflex. It was instead categorized by the attack type. So, like I said, dragon breath, wands, poison, petrification, spells, that side of thing. That gave you a target 20-sided dice value to roll equal to or over and to successfully save. So all of that was pretty much the same, and we covered a lot of those basic mechanics and things like that in the basic D&D video. So pretty simple mechanics, a lot of D20 target numbers based on your level and your class to go and do certain things. Complexity was built in though. So there are some elements of the rules for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that add in complexity, and sometimes this complexity is useful and sometimes this complexity gets in the way of play. I'll give you a couple of examples of both. So the absolute division of race and class is a complexity in the game that adds a lot to it. So in the early editions, you had the core classes, and these were assumed to be human. If you had a dwarf, they followed the same line as fighting man. If you had a halfling, they followed the same line as fighting man. If you had an elf, then per adventure you could pick to progress as a fighting man or as a magic user, and that was how it was. Basic D&D, that kind of pulled all of these elements together. So you had, fighters, clerics, wizards, thieves, whatever. They were all humans. Then you had the dwarf, an elf, and halfling classes that made them a little bit more different. Yeah, fighters, dwarves kind of progressed and were good fighters. The idea of an elf being both a magic user and a fighter at the same time was built into the elf class, and so on. What Advanced Dungeons and Dragons did was to separate those. So instead of all elves being this, an elf could then be a thief, or it could be a magic user on its own, or it could be a fighter magic user with the multi-class options that it had. It could be a fighter thief, all sorts of things. But there were restrictions on that. So it would say things that the rules would specify dwarves can't be rangers, elves can't be paladins, and so on. The flexibility in the rules was there. So the rules never nailed you down and said you can't do this. They gave you these things, and then, especially in the Dungeon Master's Guide, lots of advice on saying, the rules are just guidelines, as they are in any role-playing game. So do with them as you wish, but just remember that the consistency and you turn up on tournament play is what's in the books. So if you wanted to allow elven paladins in your game world, all you had to really do was to ignore the table that said elves can't be paladins. They also had level restrictions for characters. So, for example, a dwarf couldn't get up to 15th level as a fighter. They were limited in level. And this was meant to be a game balance play. So non-human characters, elves and dwarves and so on, had a lot of special abilities straight out of the gate from first level on. So they kind of balanced that out because humans didn't have that by preventing non-humans from going up to the levels that humans could achieve. In later editions, this was readdressed a bit by bringing humans up to the level of non-humans from the start, and then everyone could progress together and you didn't have to have level limits and so on. But that was a decade or so in the future. So that was a positive addition of complexity into the rules. A negative one was the way that surprise and initiative was handled. Again, this is my opinion, but the original version of the game basically had both sides would roll a six-sided dice, and determining on what that roll was, one side got to go first. And this was the sort of largely accepted way. Really easy to do it. You did it round by round instead of nowadays you roll one initiative at the start of combat. In those days, every round you rolled initiative. And so it needed to be relatively a simple thing to do. At the beginning of every round, everyone rolls initiative and then off we go. And the first round also included this idea of surprise. So in the original game, everyone rolled a six-sided dice. If either of them had a 1 or a 2, then they were surprised, lost that round. The other side got to do something unless they were surprised too. Really easy way of doing it. AD&D, the first edition, had a number of complexities introduced into this, into both surprise and into initiative. And the reason why I mention them both together is because they are tied together in terms of this. Rounds were broken down into segments, a number of segments that was an abstract unit of time. And the way that the surprise was calculated and the way that initiative was calculated determined in which segment of a round your character got to act. So at the beginning of the turn or the beginning of an encounter, everyone would roll surprise, and then depending on the difference between one side surprise roll if they were that surprised, or the other side surprise roll if they were or were not surprised, and so on, it gave one side, or might give one side, a certain number of free segments in which to act before the other side could react to them. And that's fine. Overcomplicates things a bit, drags things down a bit, adds a granularity into that surprise that's not really necessary. The D&D combat rules and combat system itself is abstract to start with. So trying to build that level of complexity or attempting to have a realistic round sequence to it kind of feels wrong. It oversteps the boundaries and doesn't feel right in terms of all the other abstracts that are going on in terms of hit points and armor class and so on, that are mishmashes of all sorts of realistic contributions. The D&D combat system for all editions of the game isn't realistic, and so trying to add realistic elements to it within the rules doesn't make much sense. If you're adding complexity to add realism to a system that isn't very realistic in the first place, you know, just leave it simple. Now, a lot of people ignored all the surprise initiative rules and just went for the old rules of rolling six-sided dice. We certainly did. Another thing that's really threw spanners in the works of all of this kind of surprise complex is the default was a six-sided dice, and 1 or 2 you're surprised, same as it was in other editions. But there were some characters that surprised on different rolls, and some characters and creatures or whatever that are only surprised on different rolls, and a lot of those were described in terms of six-sided dice, which is fine. There were some that were surprised or surprise on different die rolls, on a 8-sided dice roll or on a 10-sided dice roll, or sometimes even on a percentage dice roll. Now this then means that people have to sit down and calculate what the heck it all means. If you have something that surprises on a 1 to 4 on 1d8, and something that is only surprised on a 1 on a 1d6, how do those correlate? How do you work it out? And so the maths of that had to be in the rulebook, the description of how that worked that out. had to be in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which meant the rules for surprise themselves, instead of being one short paragraph, ended up being 9 paragraphs, or probably a full page of rules to handle the fact that you've got all of these different elements in the surprise. And then adding on from that, you had to consider spellcasting time. You had to consider weapon speed, and they folded into initiative as well. So if you're using a weapon that was a slow weapon, then you could roll a really good initiative, but you'd still act later in the round because you're dealing with a weapon that's quite slow to use. If you're casting a spell, you get enough segments in your surprise to be able to cast that, because some of the casting times were in segments, then you could get it off. Otherwise it would go onto the initiative, and then you'd have to consider that. Characters ended up with multiple attacks. The fighting classes got an attack progression, a number of attacks progression. It went 1 every round, to 3 every 2 rounds, to 2 every round, to 5 every 2 rounds. So you had to keep track of that. But folding that into segments and weapon speeds and the initiative round, it meant that your first attack would occur at some point in the initiatives round, in the round in segments. And then your second attack, if you got it that round, because you might not get it the next round because of 3 to 2 or 5 to 2 or whatever, would attack at some point further on down the line in the round. And then if you were lucky enough to have a third attack or whatever, that would be further on in the round as well. So it was a lot of calculating where things were in a single round. A lot more detail in that one element of the combat rules, where all of the other elements of the combat rules are simplified and abstract. It was unnecessary, and most of us ignored it until 2nd edition, which brought in a better system for handling them. Those elements of the rules were overly complicated. So you had some good complications added into the game, you had some bad complications added into the game, and you had a whole bunch of stuff that was expanded out from the classic and the basic versions of Dungeons and Dragons that allowed more room for DMs to play around with things. A lot of elements of the game that were expanded in ways that left some good gaps for inspiration and tactics, not just combat tactics, but tactics to fill up those things. Keep your mind going as a player and a DM. So for the purpose of reviewing Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition, I'm going to do this in 3 separate sections, because as the game progressed and certain rulebooks were released, the game did fundamentally change in nature. So the first section of first section of the review will be just for the core game itself, the Dungeon Master's Guide and Player's Handbook. So with the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide alone, you get a good, solid, consistent game. As we've discussed, some complexity added in for the better, and some complexity added in for the worse. Rolling characters, there are things missing from the books that make rolling characters up a little bit difficult or a little bit obscure. Like if your Dungeon Master used encumbrance and put a good emphasis on it, then trying to tie together encumbrance written in pounds in one place, written in gold pieces in another place, trying to work out what the actual movement meant to your carrying capacities, to your enhanced carrying capacity from your strength that was written in gold pieces again. And it was difficult to work out. You only had to work it out once before you actually got the hang of it, but trying to tie all of these bits from across the 2 books together to make sense of it in the first case was a bit weird. Trying to get your head around surprise and initiative, a lot of people just went, forget it, we'll go and do something else. So the structure of the books is a little bit odd. Once you get used to where things are in the Dungeon Master's Guide, then things become a little bit easier. If you get a Dungeon Master screen that's got all the tables and things on it, definitely becomes far easier than to play the game. It's a lot of looking up and things like that. I would say that the basic game, the basic Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game, with the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide alone, I would say that's about a 3.5 out of 5. The Dungeon Master's Guide alone, on its own, as a role-playing game resource, is probably a 6 out of 5. I really do believe that every fantasy role-playing gamer should have a copy of that on their shelves somewhere to delve into, purely for the appendices and some of the gaming advice it gives. Part 2, Dungeon Master's Guide Player's Handbook and the Unearthed Arcana. Now, there is a lot of stuff in the Unearthed Arcana that feels like it may have been play-tested individually, but not play-tested as a whole when added in with all the other material in the game. So there are some really interesting bits in there. The Thief Acrobat is a nice option to add in. The Cavalier and the Barbarian, I think, are wholly unnecessary. I don't think they add enough to those characters to warrant them being separate character classes. The new races and so on, again, with the new races in there, if you're going to allow people to just play Drow, then expect your game to be difficult to manage unless you ignore a whole swathe of additional baggage that may come along with those. Some of the things in the Unearthed Arcana that are good: additional magical items, always welcome. Additional spells, always welcome. Again, some of the spells don't feel like that they have been play tested as part of the whole, so there's a bit of caution there. Some advice that's things like acquisition of spells by magic users and illusionists, and spell books. They are really a really good addition to the rules, I think. And then there's some interesting bits and pieces at the end. There's an unarmed combat system that really is a lot easier to use than the unarmed combat system from the core game. There is the reproduction of an article about pole arms that Gary Gygax wrote that appeared in Dragon magazine originally, that is useful if you want to see what pole arms look like rather than just the stats for them. And the gods of the non-human gods that were, again, they were reprinted from Dragon magazine articles that introduced those. It's all useful stuff. So the game, with elements from the Unearthed Arcana introduced into it, really needs two settings. If you pick up the Unearthed Arcana and include it wholesale into your game, then I think you form a version of Dungeons and Dragons that breaks. So I think that brings the whole rating of the game down to maybe 2.5. However, if you are selective about which material that you allow into your games as a Dungeon Master, and you pick only those things that are going to work together, it's not a case of things working like the Cavalier. The Cavalier may have been play tested on its own and see if that works, and that's fine. But you're producing a whole rule book, so if the Cavalier wasn't play tested with the whole of the material that's in Unearthed Arcana, with the whole of the material that's in the original rules, then it could be a problem. But if your game allows for that, if you want to include Cavaliers into your game, and you have structured your game to be able to handle everything that comes with Cavaliers, then that's fine. It can serve to really up your game. And I'm talking about everything that's in Unearthed Arcana, not just Cavaliers. I'm just picking on Cavaliers because when the book was released, they were a bit of a bugbear of mine. So with selective elements from the Unearthed Arcana, carefully selected, that you've thought about and worked out how they're going to fit into your campaign, I think it elevates the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rules probably up to a 4. Now finally, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition, with the inclusion of the rules from the Dungeoneers and the Wilderness Survival Guides. These books clean up a lot of stuff. They clean up encumbrance. So like I said at the start, with just the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide alone, there's a bit of hunting down and a bit of thought process to try and bring all of these bits together to figure out an encumbrance. In the Wilderness Survival Guide, it's laid out, it's easy. There's also the introduction of non-weapon proficiencies. The Dungeon Master's Guide introduced the idea of secondary skills, which are sort of like non-weapon proficiencies, but there's no rules for them. It's like an abstract, like most of Dungeons and Dragons. But it's like this is something that the characters know about, and then it's up to the Dungeon Master and the players of how they're actually used. With non-weapon proficiencies, they add some nice things, as well as all the mundane side of things like cooking and whatever. They add some good stuff in there that can help to enhance the game in different ways. So, for example, the first aid proficiency that allows anyone with the first aid proficiency to be able to heal in a lesser extent to the healing spells of clerics. But what that does, it alleviates some of the pressure to take healing spells, or at least the low-level healing spells, from clerics. So just by introducing non-weapon proficiencies that open up the possibility for a character to go and take first aid, you could have the whole party with taking first aid, whatever. With first aid proficiency, then the cleric is alleviated somewhat of that healing role. And those other things as well. So blind fighting, for example, that dropped the level of devastation that could come with darkness. If you've got characters that can still continue to fight when they're blind, or reduce the penalties for doing so, then the effect on play, the threat of darkness becomes less. Those books also introduce some really odd bits of esoteria that may not be useful on a game-by-game basis, may not be used all the time, but they may be used, and may be used to interesting effect for particular scenarios, particular environments, particular games. Like, for example, in the Dungeoneer Survival Guide, you can find the rules for the chance of detecting a very smelly monster 1,000 feet away where there is a medium cross breeze. Those rules are there. The Wilderness Survival Guide also gave you the effect on body temperature that wearing plate has. Now, this is good, all sorts of other armor as well. This is good if you're playing an adventure where the environment is important, either cold or hot. Brings to mind the Desert Desolation series, the I3, 4 and 5 modules, where the desert is as much a threat as the monsters in the scenario going on around it. So having those rules and bringing those rules in, like if you are going to go and travel a lot around in the desert and you're sitting there wearing full plate mail, then you're going to get yourself into heat difficulties. If you are wandering around in the frigid cold with a short-sleeved leather jerkin, then you're going to run into difficulties. So while those rules are not useful all the time, they can be useful in some points to introduce interesting things into the game, so particularly as challenges for players and so on. So to my mind, the addition of the Wilderness Survival Guide and the Dungeoneer Survival Guide, they can just elevate the game up again by maybe half a point. So 4.5 if you've selectively chosen things from the Unearthed Arcana, but less than that if you've just taken everything wholesale. So the essentials. Where do you start with playing first edition Dungeons and Dragons? Well, the simple thing is to go and get a copy of the Monster Manual, the Player's Handbook, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. They're widespread on eBay. You can also pick up the reprintings that Wizard of the Coast have published, and they are on print on demand and on Drive-Thru RPG. So if you've got a sectionally shabby copy of the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide, then print on demand is quite a useful thing. Other books are also available. Drive-Thru RPG, the Unearthed Arcana, is available there. All of the other books are available in PDF format. There's only a few that are on print on demand. at the time of this video. I think the Fiend Folio is available as a print-on-demand in softback. But other than that, Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, Dungeon Master's Guide, they're all print-on-demand. Unearthed Arcana, they're all print-on-demand. But just start with those 3 books. Monster Manual, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide. If you find that you like the game and want more options for it, then start heading towards Unearthed Arcana, Dungeon Master, the Dungeoneer Survival Guide, Wilderness Survival Guide, and so on. The Fiend Folio, Monster Manual 2, they add some really strong creatures into the game. They're good source books to have floating around. Deists and Demigods, depends what you want to do. They introduce some options if you're using real world / mythology / history, whatever. If you want to add those in, then yeah, I mean, go for it. If you want clerics of Set or clerics of Odin and so on floating around, then yeah, by all means. They also introduce some additional things about the planes and the cleric raiment colour and stuff like that you can use to add that element into your own worlds if you want to go that route. As far as starting adventures go, there's 3 I would recommend. Village of Homlet, T1, or it's included wholesale in the T1 to 4 Temple of Elemental Evil, and which is available print on demand on in drive-through. That is a neat parcel of stuff. It's similar to B2 as we discussed in the basic Dungeons and Dragons video, where you've got an established base camp with some things going on there, and then a remote location to that with something to adventure in. Little mini campaign setting in its own right. And T1 provides that. You have the village itself, and you have a ruin that the player characters can go investigate. N1, against the Cult of the Reptile God, is again, it's a low-level beginner module. A little bit more interesting and a little bit more role-playing involved in that. It's not quite as simple as here's a base camp and here's a dungeon. It's more a case of here's a base camp that is increasingly antagonistic, and to solve it you've got to go off and do the dungeon. It's one of my favourites, but it's an interesting take on things, especially if players are more used to there's a base camp and there's the adventure site, and we know that we've got a safe place to come back to, because where they come back to might not be as safe as they thought. And finally, module N4, Treasure Hunt. Now, Treasure Hunt is ideal for people that have never played before and they're trying to pick the game up for the first time. Character generation is taken a little bit of a different slant in that you start as normal people, 0 level or whatever you want to call it. You don't choose a class. What you do is you play through the module, and the Dungeon Master during the course of that will record the various activities and things that your character has done, and at the end of the module you achieve first level and get to choose your class then. So it's a good way of learning to play the game with a minimum of things in the way. You've only got to worry about your race abilities and your ability scores, and get used to the way that combat works, and get used to the way the saving throws and things work. Get used to the mechanics of the game, and then the complexity of having a class is introduced right at the end once you know how all the mechanics go. So N4 Treasure Hunt is a really interesting module and a really good way for introducing new players to first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So in summary, with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons we're talking about the foundation of the industry as it is today. Yes, classic Dungeons & Dragons sold quite a lot, provided the popularity of role-playing, allowed other people to start pushing their role-playing games and publishing it. It kick-started it. But the industry itself was really built on the foundation of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Some of the concepts in there, like the separation of referee and player information into hardback books with nice art for the time, with good presentation, with a solid way that they are organised and written, which improved over time. First edition is probably not the best example that is available now of how a game should be laid out, but back then it really was something special. If you went in and there were the various games that were available in 78, 79, you're talking about games like Traveller and RuneQuest and so on. The Advanced Dungeons and Dragons books really did stand out. They really were something special at the time. Without Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, the industry that we have today, with its many different games, we wouldn't have it. It just wouldn't have been brought up that way. For those players that are playing 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, that 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons isn't built on basic Dungeons and Dragons, what was just called Dungeons and Dragons back in 77. It's built on 1st edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It's just the advanced bit was dropped with the publication of 3rd edition in 2000. So you're playing today the ancestor of 1st edition Dungeons and Dragons with the 5th edition of the game. And as a closing note, I will reiterate, at fear of sounding like a fanboy for this particular thing, but I will reiterate, whatever fantasy role-playing game you play, the 1st edition Dungeon Master's Guide is a work that you really should have in your collection. The appendices really make that book special. They are incredible. And take the bibliography from the Appendix N, and read those books. They are many varied, and some of them are absolute fantasy classics. So thank you for watching. This has been my take on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition. These videos are meant to just give you an overview of the whole game, rather than delving into specific books. I know we take some books and go into them a little bit more depth than others, but that's kind of necessary to get the feel of the way it's going on. So we'll be covering other games as we go along through this. Not all of them will be serious games, and we'll be doing other editions of Dungeons and Dragons, as well as touching into other classic games such as RuneQuest and Rolemaster and Traveller as we go. I had said I'm trying to put one of these out one a week, but you know, real life, I am a working man. I can't throw all my time into putting these things together. They're not they don't take a short amount of time to try and dredge up my old copies of books and remind myself how they all fit together and work. So they may end up being once a fortnight, or whenever I can find the odd slot to put scripts together and to review, remind myself of the games, and to actually stand in front of a camera. So I hope you enjoyed that. Please, if you've got any questions or comments or anything, then you know where to put them, and then all of that subscribe-y, bell ringing-y stuff too. Enjoy.